that we think of it not as an Anabaptist idea, but as an American idea. But the source of that idea wasn't Boston, Massachusetts, 1776. It was a good 150 years earlier. So this morning, we're going to talk about a lot of people's least favorite topic. One that sends a lot of people running at its first mention. One of three things that I was told not to bring up at the dinner table. And the one thing that I hoped never to preach a sermon on. Let's talk politics. Now, before we start, I should clarify, I'm not going to talk about political parties or candidates for reasons that I hope will become clear. That's a sermon I will never preach. And for some of you, that will be a relief to hear. For others, maybe it's a disappointment. But what we are going to talk about today is what, if any, is the relationship of the church to worldly power structures. Now, the first place we look, as always, is the scriptures. Now, for the sake of time, I'm just going to give an overview of the New Testament teachings. If you're interested, the chapters I'll be drawing from are Matthew 22, John 19, Acts 5, Romans 13, Ephesians 6, Philippians 3, 1 Timothy 2, Titus 3, and 1 Peter 2. I'm not going to sit here and make you sit through me reading all of that, but please do feel free to check my work. Now, the long and short of it is that as Christians, we are expected to pay our taxes, pray for government officials, submit ourselves to the authority of the government, except that we are to obey God before and above any human voice or institution. And finally, to remember that our true citizenship is not on earth, but in heaven. And our true struggle is not against people, but against systems, against culture, and against demonic influences. Things that cannot be seen or struck or torn down. And that's pretty much it. I mean, most of these things are reiterated 2 or 3 times, but that's all the direct guidance that we're given. Beyond that, we have to rely on general principles and on the example set by Christ himself. Now, this has looked a little bit different at different points in history because context matters, right? I mean, the early church was under a pagan government in which they had no say and no expectation that they would ever have a say. Holding a government office in Rome wasn't just a civic role, it was a religious one. The emperor was worshipped as a god, and holding political office meant acknowledging that. So, of course, they refused to serve the emperor. Now, if we fast forward to the beginnings of the Anabaptist movement, the beginnings of the Mennonites, they were living under a supposedly Christian government, though still one in which they had no real say. But it did change the question, right? For them, the question was, is it permitted to serve a Christian government? Or more fundamentally, can a government ever be Christian? Now, it's hard to really pin down exactly what the early Anabaptists thought, because Anabaptism was really the kind of thing that would spring up basically wherever the Bible became available in the common tongue, which meant that it had about a dozen or two different places that it sprung up with very little contact between each other in the early years. It took decades for any sort of consensus to emerge on some of the trickier theological questions. Having said that, the first large-scale attempt to enumerate Anabaptist beliefs, and also the strand of Anabaptism that would survive through till today, was called the Schleitheim Confession in 1527. And it posed 7 points of agreement between Anabaptists. The points which are relevant this morning are number 4, on separation from the world, and number 6, on the use of force. Now, when they talked about separation, point 4, they explicitly called for believers to, quote, flee from and shun all civic affairs, along with state churches, drinking houses, and commitments made in unbelief. Now, when they discussed the use of the sword, of course, they came down on the side of nonviolence, but they also forbade people from becoming magistrates or judges. And the reasoning was that, quote, the government is according to the flesh, but the Christian is according to the Spirit. The weapons of their conflict are carnal and against the flesh, but the Christian's weapons are spiritual, against the fortification of the devil. They basically concluded that no government could ever be Christian because the very nature of worldly governments was that they employed tools that were outside of the perfection of Christ. Governments were part of the natural order that God had created, but Christians are called to rise above the natural and to seek a spiritual order. Now, in modern times, the questions have changed again. The government no longer even claims to be Christian, but Christians do now have a say in what government does. We've been given worldly power whether we seek it or not. And for a long time, Mennonites mostly chose not to use that power. For people who are from Mennonite families, your grandparents probably grew up in a time when the standard was for Mennonites not to vote. And for them, it was about keeping the two kingdoms separate, the kingdom of light from the kingdom of darkness. One cannot partake of the other, they argued, nor can anyone serve two masters. Now, that didn't stop them from speaking out against slavery. They lambasted it as the sin of Babylon. For a slave owner to join the Church of the Brethren, for instance, which is the tradition I'm most familiar with, they first had to free their slaves and pay them reparations, which is a big part of why the Church of the Brethren really never got a foothold in the South. It also didn't stop them from starting the Underground Railroad, which is yet another example where the ministry is better known than the Anabaptists who started it. It didn't stop them from caring for wounded soldiers from both sides of the Civil War, regardless of the consequences to themselves and or their communities. All of those things would have been called political actions by the people at the time. Just like adult baptism was considered a political action in the 1500s. Just like the statement, Jesus is Lord, was considered a political action in ancient Rome. But for none of those people was it ever about the politics. It was about following the command of God, regardless of the cost and regardless of how the world might label it. Now, this started to change in the 1960s, and there were two basic reasons for that: Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement. That was the first time when a large number of Mennonites started to say to themselves, yes, it will always be the kingdom of darkness, but maybe it can be a little less dark. And between the 1960s and today, Mennonites have become progressively more involved in politics and progressively more optimistic about the potential for the world to shed some of that darkness, even though they still acknowledge that the world will never attain the perfection of Christ. Today, the majority of Mennonites do participate in government. They vote. They don't see any inherent contradiction between living as citizens of heaven and participating in the ordering of earth. The best expression that I was able to find of the current state was from a blurb by Wendy Chapel Dick that was published in the Mennonite. She writes, "As Christians, we are at odds with all governments that would claim our allegiance. When Mennonites vote, we are not voting for who we support to lead us. We are voting for who we would rather struggle against." That seems to be roughly where the current Mennonite denomination lands, with, on average, with people kind of on either side of that point of view. And so you should understand that what I'm about to put forward is not the Mennonite position. It's not the third way position. It's not even the majority view. But I have been encouraged to share my view on the topic. For me, the line of reasoning is pretty straightforward. As a follower of Christ, I am not allowed to wield the power of the sword. Government depends and relies on the power of the sword. Therefore, I am not allowed to wield the power of government. That's it. That's why I cannot vote. But there are things that we can and must do as Christians. When Jesus talked about the church, he called it the light of the world, a city on a hill that cannot be hid. That language of a city on a hill was a reference to Jerusalem, the capital city. The church is supposed to lead, but not as the world leads. We are supposed to let our good deeds shine so that people see them and glorify God. We are supposed to show the world a better way. In Matthew 20, Jesus tells his disciples, "The rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it will not be so among you. Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Jesus demonstrated through his own life what leadership should look like. And if we truly wish to become Christ-like, we should do like Christ did. We should demonstrate through our own lives how the world ought to live. Governments rule by force. The church rules by example. The world wields a sword of iron, which destroys the wicked. We wield a sword of the Spirit, which saves them. I think that we have gone too far down the road of accommodating evil. We are too ready to join hands with the kingdom of darkness, and it is costing us our witness. When we join with what the world is doing, we lose our ability and our opportunity to show a better way. Now, I know that I'm in the minority on this. I might be the only person here who refuses to vote. We're a small enough church that joining something bigger, more experienced, and better funded has a lot of appeal to it. I get that, I really do. But at the same time, I think there's something unique about the Anabaptist tradition. Something that isn't going to be part of a secular movement. And I think that that uniqueness is something that the world really badly needs to see. So at this point, I will take my place in front of the firing squad and field a few questions.
We're gonna do the Q&A a little different this time. If you wanna raise your hand, just so people that are joining us online can hear you, I'll